All right, welcome everyone to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 12th of June, 2019. It's a question and answer session. We're jumping right in today. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right in there. So the first question here is from Kevin, the basic filmmaker, and he says, what camera should I buy? I should say I have the right to reserve, uh, I reserve the right, excuse me, to disqualify any questions. This one is disqualified with all due respect, Kevin. All right, next up from the Kevin again. For your YouTube videos, do you do simple or complicated post-editing, and what do you do? Simple compression? Match loudness? Nothing? That's a good question. So I think simple versus complicated is very much a relative thing. I do something that some people may consider complicated, but I consider it fairly straightforward because, again, I'm very focused on sound. But for YouTube videos, and this is very different than when I'm working with a narrative film or even a corporate video, where I'm going to do a more careful job and a more kind of clinical job to really kind of bring the overall mix together. But for YouTube videos, generally what I'm doing is I shoot what I call the main storyline. That is the talking head portion of my YouTube video, all in one take. And so that's really going to be 99% of the sound I use. In most cases, it's actually 100% of the sound I use, aside from the intro and outro music. In those cases, what I do is I actually process the sound first using Adobe Audition and Isotope RX. And basically, I don't do a whole lot in Audition. I basically bring it into Audition if I need to split up the channels, I can do that there. And then I take the dialogue track, usually in mono at that point, over into Isotope. I do a little bit of compression. I do a little bit of a low pass filter or a high pass filter if I need that. A little bit of debreathing, and then I loudness normalize, and that's it. Bring it back into Audition. There's a little quirk, or there used to be, and I just made this a habit in Final Cut Pro 10. Sometimes it does funny things when you're trying to create dual mono out of a mono track. So instead of it playing just out of one speaker, you want it to play out of both. So I actually convert it into dual mono in Audition. I save it. I bring it into my nonlinear editor, my video editing app, which in my case, in most cases, is going to be Final Cut Pro 10. I sync up the sound to the video and I cut from there. And that's basically what I do for my sound. So for some people, I think that would be considered complicated. I know a lot of people would prefer to do everything in their video editing app, and that's fine if you want to do that. I don't have a lot of things I can do to help from that standpoint. So I guess from my standpoint, mine is probably more complicated than others, but that's what I do for the YouTube videos. For narrative films, that's a completely different thing. That is where I spend most of my time in either DaVinci Resolve Fairlight or Adobe Audition. And in fact, this is going to come up a little bit later, but at this point, the only Creative Cloud application that I still subscribe to is Adobe Audition. I don't use Premiere, so I don't subscribe to it anymore. I replaced Photoshop with Affinity Photo, and that's good enough for what I do. I missed Lightroom a little bit, but I didn't use it that much anyway. I never used After Effects just because that's not my thing. I would actually have somebody do visual effects for me before I would do them. So that's just where I'm at personally. That doesn't mean you have to do that, but that's generally what I do. So thanks for that question, Kevin. Mark, I need to sync multiple audio clips to one camera video using Resolve 16. I'm attempting to sync and attach 3 audio tracks, boom on 1 and lavs on 2 and 3 to my clip with timecode. I recorded on my Zoom F8N to Polywave and extracted the files following your video using Wave Agent. I selected all the audio and the single clip, and I selected sync audio timecode. This did not work for me. Could you please help? Also in future, do you think I should select mono separate files for individual tracks when using multiple mics? I'm only a novice at this. Mark, that's a good question, and this is something I think most of us trip on at some point. I actually would just keep it as a poly wave file. Bring it into Resolve as a poly wave file and sync it as a poly wave file. Then when you get to the Fairlight tab, then you can get rid of the stuff you don't want. So for example, I wouldn't normally keep both the boom mic and the lav mic for any individual actor. I would choose which one sounds better and cut that portion out for for that portion where I don't need it. So I would keep the boom in most cases, get rid of the lav. But if there's a line that sounds better on the lav, which happens sometimes, then I'd keep the lav track and cut that portion of the boom track out and get rid of it. So it just really depends. That's the main workflow. That way you don't have to use Wave Agent and split things up. There's no need to do that. Just sync it all as a poly wave file in DaVinci Resolve. And I hope that'll save you a lot of time and effort. All right, next up from Dick. Love what you're doing for the community and for me on audio to help to make me more professional. I have a question. In a couple of weeks, I must shoot a multi-person interview and live stream this to the internet by OBS Wirecast. I'm a one-man band and it is not possible then to mix, so I'm looking for some kind of auto mix function. I have a Sound Devices MixPre 10T as my interface to my MacBook Pro. Is there a solution? I think using some kind of software, but must run in real time. The other solution is not an auto mix function, but run the signal of each person to a DBX286 preamp and set compressor and limiter to silence when the person is not speaking. This is not my definition of a portable system. Do you have suggestions about this, or must I rent a higher end sound devices? So there are, you could use a DBX286 and you would use the expander gate to essentially turn off the microphones that aren't currently being talked into. That is a solution. You're right. It's not super small. It's not super mobile. But that is, basically that's one of the things that the 286 is really good at is for live broadcasts. So that's one option. MixPre does not have an auto mix function, as you well know. You could use software and you do the same things you would do with a DBX286. You'd use an expander to basically cut things. That's a lot more complicated than I can explain how to do here, but that is possible using a digital audio workstation. If you can then feed that, you'll probably need some software to redirect the sound signal chain through your computer. You're going to bring the mics into the digital audio workstation, then you're going to have to route it over to the to OBS and Wirecast to broadcast that. So there will be some potentially additional latency involved there. So you could have more sync issues. So just so you're aware of those things. But yeah, you could technically do that. You could rent a Sound Devices 633 or 688. Those have an auto mix feature built into them. And then you would route that. Here's the thing. The 633 and the 688 are not audio interfaces. So you couldn't route those directly into your computer. You have to take the outputs of that and run that into your MixPre and then into the computer. So things get pretty complicated no matter how you look at it. So unfortunately, I don't have a simple answer, Dick, but those are the options mainly as I see. You could use DBX286s. Another thing you could do is you could maybe borrow or rent a Zoom F8 or an F8N. It has an auto mix feature, and you could run that directly into your computer, so that's an option. But with the MixPre 10T, unfortunately, directly, that's not an option. So hopefully that's helpful for you and gives you some ideas of things you could work with. Next up from Clayton, we have a whole bunch of questions. Number one, when you use the Rode Blimp, do you leave the dresser on the boom inside the Blimp? I think you mean by that the foam wind cover. And the answer is no, I don't. Typically, I don't do that because anytime you put a little bit of foam, anytime you put foam on a microphone, which helps with preventing plosives, you cut a little bit of the high frequency sound that gets through to the capsule. If you have both the Blimp and the foam on, it can start to sound pretty muffled. And so typically I don't do that. Number two, does using the Blimp and taking off the front of the Blimp cut down on reverb indoors? I don't know. It's worth a try. I would not expect a night and day difference, but it might help a little bit. But I wouldn't expect a whole lot because if you're going to have the front of the microphone or the front of the Blimp off, then all that sound, the reverberation, at least the stuff that's bouncing directly into the capsule, will still get captured by the microphone. So anyway, it's an interesting experiment worth doing. Is there a technique for condensing and expanding a boom pole that is effective every time? I have to leave margins in between the different grip rings in order to expand and condense the sections of the boom pole and lock the sections in. If I don't give myself the margins, I can't tighten down the individual sections well enough to rotate the boom mic if I need to. Also, sometimes when I'm tightening some sections, it mysteriously loosens other sections. This is super annoying, and I'm wondering if there's a technique for this to be avoided. I think typically what I do is I hold on to the end closer to the rest the bottom of the boom pole down on the ground or wherever I can. Hold on to the section that I'm tightening or loosening above or closest to the shock mount and tighten it that way. That way it won't rotate on you. And you can have a grip on that and be able to tighten it down that way. That's what I do. And that seems to work on my particular boom pole, which is, I actually have two boom poles. They're both K-Techs. And that seems to work pretty nicely. They're the K-Tech. They're not the classics. They're the other ones, the Avalon. And that works great when I'm doing it. I have heard of other boom operators doing the little thing where they extend just a little bit of each section out so that it's easier to do what you're talking about. So that way you can do it without setting the end down. I do it between takes if I have to usually. But if you have, for some reason, a need to do that, can't imagine doing it during a take, but maybe some magical boom operators do that. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that. Hopefully that's helpful for you, Clayton. And then number 4, have you seen the boom pole holder chair? Actually, I have seen things like that. That is pretty cool. About $250, holds the boom pole upright when you're away from it. Those are pretty handy so that when you're on set, and I've struggled with that a lot. I don't have anything that holds a boom pole right now. I've seen a lot of carts that have hooks that you can hook the boom pole into. So you can basically set it down in between takes or when you're on break or whatever, so that it's not cumbering the set and it's not going to be tripped over by somebody. But yeah, that's a pretty cool idea. Number 5, do you think the Zoom F6 is going to eliminate the need for sound mixers on set? Absolutely no, I don't think it is, because when you're talking about sound mixers on set, you're talking about location sound mixers or production sound mixers. The person who is responsible for capturing good production audio. Setting gain is not the only thing that a production sound mixer does, and so that's only doing one thing. And you still, as a production sound mixer, have to deliver a mix that works for, if it depends on what you're working on. So let me qualify it with that, and I'll come back to that. You still have to deliver a mix. You still have to mix the microphones so there's something for editorial to use, for the editors to use. So those are some things to consider. Now, it could potentially replace a buddy that's doing sound on low and no budget productions, and I think that's fine because those people aren't going to, they're not paying money anyway, generally. And so for those people, it's just going to probably result in slightly better sound, hopefully. But no, I definitely don't think, I've heard a lot of people express that sentiment on the first look that we did at the kind of the NAB piece we did on the Zoom F6. I don't see it replacing production sound mixers at all. I don't think sound producers need to be worried about their jobs. Is there a preferred clapper app for iPad or iPhone you like to use for proper old school sound sync? Also, is there a clapper app that can take time code, especially via Bluetooth? Or how would you get proper time code to the app to show on screen? Curious. I don't know the answer to that, so I guess I should say that in this question and answer session, there are a few questions I don't know the answer to. So I'm going to summon the humility to confess when I don't know. And this is one I don't know. I did many years ago use an iPad app. I didn't like how it worked. And actually, I almost always use a good old-fashioned non-time code slate with a clapper on it, period. That's what I use. And then I use time code on the cameras. So the clapper board for me becomes an easy way to identify for editorial at the start of each clip what it is. And it also is there as a backup in case something happens with the time code generators. Of course, you could add this, and perhaps some people in the comments know anything. If anyone that's watching has comments or ideas about that, if you could help out our brother here, we would appreciate it. So thanks for those questions, Clayton. Next up from Daniel, do you know how to create a separate left and right channel audio files from a single video file in Davinci Resolve? Daniel, the secret to that is using the channel mapping. So once you have brought the audio in, and the video clip in, if you're in the Fairlight panel, you go up to the Fairlight menu and you go to channel mapping. You can, if I understand your question correctly, you can take whatever's recorded on the left channel and tell Resolve how you want it to play that back, whether you want it to stay on the left channel, whether you want it to be dual mono or stereo, or however you want it to do. So that's how you manipulate things in terms of the channel mapping in Davinci Resolve Fairlight. All right, next up from Alejandro. I was recently told by one of my Instagram followers of a new cardioid mic with interchangeable capsules called the Nevaton MC59. It's a Russian company, a direct competitor to Oktava microphones. I'm not sure if it's sold in the US as of yet, but if you can do a review, compare it to the Oktava 012, that would be great. Here's the link to their site, and they also make an omnidirectional capsule in the event you have used it. What are your thoughts? I have not used it, Alejandro. But what we can do, let's get over to the right tab here. For those that have not seen it, this is the microphone he's talking about. It runs $620 or 620 euro, excuse me, exclusive of VAT. It has a cardioid capsule as well as an omnidirectional capsule. Just looking at the specs and things of that nature, it looks fine. Here are the frequency response charts. It looks like when it's cardioid, it has a typical kind of presence peak here, starting at, a little before 10 kilohertz. That's not unusual, actually. Spec-wise, it looked good. I have not seen them here in the United States yet, but I'll keep my eye out for them. I have not reviewed them yet, so thanks for the tip. it's pretty helpful. We may take a look at those at some point in the future. All right. Thank you for that, Alejandro. Michael, my question is, how do I set markers on audio recorders in the Zoom H series, specifically on the Zoom H6 and the H4n, and also the Zoom F8 and MixPre series? Also, how does that translate into a DAW like Logic or Adobe Audition? These are markers that highlight specific points in the recording. Michael, I don't know the answer for the Zoom H6 or the H4n, but you should be able to look that up in the documentation over at the Zoom site. I did look it up for the Zoom F8 and F4, as well as the MixPre series. On the Zoom F8, you can actually go into the System menu and then into the Play button. I think it's called Play button option or something like that. And that allows you to choose what the play button does while you're recording. And what you want to do is probably set that to mark only, so that when you're recording and you press the play button, it will set a mark at that point in the recording. There are other options to pause and place a mark. You might want to do that. I don't know. Some people would use that more like I would think in a podcast, to put a marker there and take a little break. So that's one way you can do it. The MixPre 6, it's similar. There is a, I don't remember the button you use to place the mark, but to actually go look at the marks, there's a little waveform icon. You tap on that, and then it will show you all the markers, and you can go in there. On the MixPre, you have a little bit more flexibility. You can actually name the marks, so that can be useful as well. And the way it comes over in any DAW that recognizes broadcast wave format files, it comes across as a marker. And in the case of the MixPre, it will also bring the names over as well. So just take a look at the documentation for the H6 and the H4n on the Zoom site to get the details for those. I don't know if those do markers or not. I wouldn't be surprised if they do, but I don't really know. So hope that helps a little bit, Michael. All right, next from Holger. His question's really long, so it didn't fit on one page. I'm going to summarize this a little bit. So I did a video a while back. There was a sound for video session, I believe, or maybe it was a YouTube, maybe it was on the other channel. I don't remember, but it had to do with cases where you're using a mirrorless camera or a DSLR, an Atomos recorder to record the video, and the MixPre, and being able to trigger all three of those using the record button on just the camera. And I didn't know the answer to that. I was hoping that Atomos, I was kind of thinking it looked like the problem was with Atomos recorders, that it wasn't passing through the HDMI signal, the time code, either the time code or the start and stop signals. So what we found is somebody had mentioned that they actually bought this particular HDMI splitter called the JTech 18GSP12M. Really awesome name. And that seemed to work. And what they did is they ran the HDMI out from the camera into the splitter, and then the splitter each to the Atomos recorder and the MixPre, and they got everything working. So that's cool. Holger asked a question here. Well, he actually used a splitter, and he got his splitter to work. So that's cool. But he said he doesn't think it's the same quality. It was a lot less expensive, but he wants to know how he can check to make sure it's not messing with his video. Well, first of all, I would just check to make sure you're getting the right resolution. So if you are recording 4K and you're trying to pass 4K over the cables through the splitter into the Atomos recorder, just take your footage into your video editing app and make sure it's the right resolution. Then from there, just use your eyes to determine if it's affecting the quality in any way. So that's what I would do. And hopefully that gets you what you need. Next question here. Next question I'm going to summarize as well. So basically you're asking, how do I get to use Room EQ Wizard to work so that I can measure my room where I'm going to be doing my recording? A couple of thoughts on that. So let me I do have a tutorial I would recommend for Room EQ Wizard. It's on the GIK Acoustics website. So if you just Google for GIK Acoustics Room EQ Wizard tutorial, you'll find it. That's what I used to learn how to do Room EQ Wizard. However, what I would say as well is that I'm not sure that Room EQ Wizard helps a lot for recording purposes necessarily. Usually people use that to optimize the setup of their room for mixing, for playing back from near-field monitors. And so generally what you're looking for, just to kind of very, very high level summarize, is you want a response that's relatively level, that doesn't have huge spikes sticking out in certain places or huge dips. That's mainly what you're looking for. It will never be Pro tip, it will never be perfectly flat. It will never even be close to perfectly flat. That is normal. Don't aim for that. You will pull your hair out and you will die not knowing how to do it. So um, that just some tips there. So I would follow that particular tutorial and hopefully that'll get you where you need to go. But really for recording, typically what I do is I'm not as concerned about that. I will just go around the room clapping. And if I hear if I hear a lot of reverb, for example, I will try to find a good place off camera to put some sound blankets, either up on a C-stand or on a hard floor if there are hard floors, things of that nature to help manage the reverberation. That's the biggest thing. You can always apply a high-pass filter to manage most of the bass issues unless it's a really, really boxy room. But that's where sound blankets can help a little bit too. So hopefully that helps you a little bit, Holger. Great questions. All right, next up from Greg. I've been stuck in noisy interior locations, bars, coffee shops, or convenience stores, unable to turn off ventilation or refrigeration, hence lots of broadband noise. I struggle to get clean audio from my Sennheiser MK-012 even when they are 1 to 2 feet away from the actor using sound blankets where I can. I've always been told to stay away from shotguns for interior work, but is there a point where it makes sense to use something like an MKH416 or Sanken CS3E, interference tube shotguns, for something with a longer reach that might pull in better signal-to-noise ratio over a simple small diaphragm condenser mic? I think, yeah, that there definitely is a case for doing that, and there are plenty of production sound mixers that will do that, and so that there, there's nothing. There's no microphone police that will come and arrest any of us for doing things. Here's the one thing. I generally have warned people against using shotgun microphones indoors, but that's not a hard and fast rule. Here's the risk if you do. And I think, Greg, you probably are well aware of this already, but so I'm just mainly sharing for everyone's benefit for those that hadn't heard this before. But the biggest risk with shotgun microphones indoors in reverberant spaces is if the microphone gets a little bit off, just the right amount off, from the sound source, usually the person speaking, and there's a good bit of reverb. I've seen situations or encountered situations where you will get a really weird phase response. And basically it has to do with the source sound coming, I think, equally or just behind through the side interference tube at the same time it's coming in the front of the microphone capsule, and it gets really kind of jumbled up. And it sounds weird, and there's not a great way to fix that in post. I don't think there's really maybe somebody's magic enough to do that, but that would be an overwhelming job from my perspective to try and fix that in post. So it sounds kind of warbly. If you know what to look for and you know how to control reverb to some extent, then you may not run into that risk, and so it's not a big deal. So in that case, you could definitely get more reach, especially, and I say reach, you could get a tighter polar pattern, a more isolated sound, especially using something like the Sanken CS3E, which has a very, very narrow polar pattern. I think there's another trade-off too, though. When you do that and you do have a lot of noise in the environment, the background noise, the ambient noise, sometimes can start to take on an otherworldly sound. So I would also warn to be careful about that. So you'll just have to make a choice about what works best for the production and what makes the most sense. So it's a really, really, really good question, and I think it's something that a lot of us struggle with at some point. Typically, I had an interesting experience recently. I totally get what you're saying. If it's a really, really noisy location, it may just make sense to do this and live with the consequences that come with it, whether that be, the rather odd sounding ambient sound, because it can start to sound kind of whooshy. So that is what it is. But if you're not able to hear what the person's saying, then you've got a bigger problem. And you can probably live with some whoosh in the background. So yeah, there's definitely a point at which you can pull that off. And I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So another thing you might consider too is maybe a hypercardioid of some sort. Like they're going to be pretty close to the MKH50s, which are super cardioid. But anyway, those are some thoughts there. I hope that's helpful, Greg. Next up from Aaron. I've been trying to move away from Adobe software for my workflow for the past 6 months, trying to move to Davinci. However, I rely heavily on Audition, After Effects, and Photoshop as well as Premiere. I've tried to replace Audition with Isotope RX7, the full suite, and while it is certainly more powerful with the tools and algorithms, especially for touch-ups, I can't help but feel that drags down my editing speed drastically. Do you have any suggestions for making this transition, or do you still rely heavily on Audition as well? So here's that question I referred to earlier on. And yeah, this is definitely a challenge, and I'm definitely in this boat here too. What I'm doing is, yes, I am attempting, and I've made some progress toward making that transition as well. Nothing against Creative Cloud. If you want to use Creative Cloud and you're comfortable with it, then I think there's a case for staying with it. If you're more efficient using it and you're able to get the things done you need to get done, then by all means. But I've been editing in Final Cut Pro 10 for years now, so I moved away from Audition in probably 2000. I think it was 2015. So I've been for 4 years or more now, 4 years probably, working in Final Cut Pro 10. So for me, Premiere was not an issue. Giving that up was not an issue. I had done a lot more photography in the past, so Lightroom and Audition, I was concerned about giving those up. I ended up using Affinity Photo for a Photoshop replacement, and for my current purposes, that's sufficient. So that's working for me. Lightroom I miss, but there are some alternatives there too. I'm not really familiar with them. I didn't end up replacing Lightroom at all because I wasn't using it that much. So for me, that wasn't a big deal. In the past, it would have been a bigger deal when I was doing almost exclusively photography. So I understand that. So you'd have to go and find something that will help you there. After Effects, there is Fusion from Blackmagic Design. So there's that option in lieu of After Effects. There's also Apple Motion, which is kind of not all of After Effects, but it's like if you're going to do motion graphics, that it certainly does that. And I'm not very familiar with that. Maybe it is closer to After Effects than that, but I don't think it is. So anyway, those are some thoughts on those. Now, I do still have my subscription to Audition because, yes, I still find it extraordinarily helpful and I still rely on it heavily. So that at least brought my monthly subscription down from $53 a month to lower 20s a month. And I haven't missed those other applications at all personally. So this is a very personal decision. I know that there are videos out there that talk about, YouTube personalities talking about how, why I left Premiere and why I moved to Davinci, or whatever. That's fine. I would take all of those as interesting conversations to help inform your decision, but I wouldn't do it because somebody else did it. I would definitely consider your own circumstances. If you're not super reliant and super used to how a particular Adobe application works, then I don't know that there's any reason to start with the Adobe Audition or the Adobe Suite necessarily. But it's like I said, it's whatever gets the job done for you. So those are some thoughts, Aaron, in terms of how I'm starting to make that transition. I am not comfortable enough with DaVinci Resolve and Fairlight to get rid of Adobe Audition because I don't think it does some of the things that Adobe Audition does. Adobe Audition is pretty unique in some ways. And the reason I like it is it does have some offline processing features. So when it comes time to do loudness normalization, while it's nice to have the loudness meter in Fairlight that helps you kind of along the way kind of ballpark things, it's not very good when you need to loudness normalize your integrated loudness, the overall piece, because you have to run through the whole darn thing to get the reading on where it sits in terms of overall integrated loudness. So for me, I would much rather do that in Audition, and actually I actually mostly do that in Isotope RX, to be entirely honest. So those are some thoughts there on that. RX7 is not, by the way, that's another important thing. RX7 is not a replacement for Adobe Audition or any other DAW at all. So I don't want anyone to ever walk away with the impression that I suggest that. It's not. It's a different kind of application. And as you say, it's really good for touch-ups. That's really what RX is for. It's for cleaning up audio generally. And for me, I use it for some finishing tasks as well, namely loudness normalization. But it's not a mixing app. You can't mix in it in terms of actually mixing multiple tracks together like you would in a digital audio workstation. So don't anyone ever think that that's really I don't think, a viable option. So great question, Aaron. I wish you the best on your journey that way and hope you find and land somewhere that works well for you. Next up from Roman. What is your recommendation for audio final loudness output for USA short film festivals? What's your recommendation for bus loudness settings, voice, sound effects, music, master? Thank you. Okay. So there when we're talking about loudness, normally the only thing I'm concerned about in the end when you go to the film festival is you should have your loudness nailed at the master bus level. The others don't make, as to me, it doesn't make sense to try and hit a target for voice sound effects and music independent of the master bus. So really, I would just say if the master bus in the United States, I would aim for minus 24 LUFS. Presumably, when you're going to a film festival, they're going to be listening back on sound systems that can reproduce your sound with a good amount of dynamic range and plenty of loudness. So you won't, it's not like when you go to the web. Nowadays, most people are consuming content on the web or on YouTube or podcasts or whatever using mobile devices, and they're often listening in places that, well, first of all, they're on mobile devices, which A, don't have the greatest speakers in the world, both in terms of reproduction quality and also in terms of their loudness, how loud they can actually play things back. Or they're listening on earbuds in many cases, and those also are not that great. So you have to push the loudness a little harder, and that's why we usually recommend minus 16 LUFS for mobile devices and web. For film festivals, I would aim for minus 24 LUFS because you'll be able to maintain a lot more dynamic range, which I think can really help what you can do. It gives you more options and it gives you a lot more latitude to be creative and to produce a really good sound design and a good sound experience for your audience. So I would just worry about the master bus. The master output bus should be about minus 24 unless the festival has other specific requirements. A lot of them don't. A lot of them now are actually telling filmmakers, and I've heard this advice from a lot of people who have been through the film festival circuits. Don't go to a film festival with bad sound. And so if you can get it normalized, loudness normalized to minus 24, I think you'll be in good shape. The reason I say don't worry as much about the music, sound effects, or the voice buses is that that's where your creative freedom comes in. So you have the freedom to move those around relative to one another. So that's why I don't think it makes sense to hit a target for those. You just do your mix using your creative sense and your sound design sense to determine where you want those relative to one another. Then you take the overall mix, the master bus, and loudness normalize that to where you want it. So great question, Roman. I'm mixing everybody's names up today. I apologize for that. Rohan, I have benefited in my work immensely from watching your channel. I have a question. 2 weeks ago, I was hosting a session in a small town. I had asked the organizers to arrange for a sound guy. He came with his soundboard, audio mixer, and 2 to 3 wireless microphones. Turned out he did not have a recording feature on the board. He had an output to a large speaker in the room, though. So first thought, and I don't know if this was your expectation, Rowan, but if you are going to be doing an event, a live event, it's very important to specify what you're looking for when you say a sound guy, because most sound guys are sound reinforcement guys. That is to say, they're there to have the microphones to reinforce the sound just there on location. They're not necessarily, and in fact, most cases are not set up to do recording. That's pretty normal. So if you are going to be doing something where you need the recording to be done, you'll want to specify that up front to the event organizers as well. So I asked him to connect a line output to my Zoom H6 for me to record. My objective was to address the audience via a microphone. However, 2 problems emerged. One, there was a lot of interference once I started speaking. Secondly, the recorded audio had weird sound, maybe because the mic was capturing both my direct sound and the sound from the speaker. What do you recommend in such scenarios to capture optimum sound? You know, when it comes to recording live events, I'm finding more and more that it makes, while you can get a feed from the board, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get a feed from the board that's post-fader. And so what I mean by that is that the sound reinforcement engineer is doing a mix that will sound good in the location, in the room, or the location where the event is occurring. So when they apply EQ, they're trying to ring out the room. That is to say, they're trying to prevent feedback. So while it will sound good in that room, it won't necessarily sound good in a recording. And in fact, even if they haven't done a lot of EQ and you record just a feed from the board post-fader, it's still going to sound odd because you won't get any audience interaction if that's important to the piece you're doing. So for example, I've recorded my wife doing a performance up on stage before. She plays violin, and it sounded really kind of weird, just like really isolated and strange, even though there was a crowd there interacting and clapping and so on and so forth. It just sounds really weird. So I find now that it actually makes more sense to record the room with your own microphones instead of getting a feed from the board, or do both, and then you have options in post as to which one you want to use. So in that case, I might have tried to record with the Zoom H6's built-in microphones and also get a feed from the board, and then you could decide in post which one made more sense to use in your final piece. So that's what I would do. The reason I would do that, and now there are other options too. You can get a pre-fader feed from the board, which is basically just the microphones coming in and not being EQ'd or anything else like that. Some boards will have the ability to do that, and some mixing engineers will have a good way to do that. Some won't, so it just depends on the situation. But if you specify up front that you're trying to record this, that will help a lot. So hopefully that helps you, Rohan. Next up from Peter. Thanks for doing this stream. I have a dilemma. I'm trying to record a solo podcast. My setup is a high LPR 40, and I'm going to actually summarize this one. The problem Peter's having is that he's trying to record a podcast. Actually, I better read this because I'm not sure if you have other... Oh, you have music and stuff playing back on your computer as well. So the problem he's having is that he's using his MixPre to record the podcast as an audio interface into his computer, but he's playing back stuff from the computer. The problem is he can't hear himself talking. And really, Peter, what it comes down to is your headphone mix. You need to... I do have an episode, if you look at on headphone or output routing. We did a demonstration. It was actually with the Zoom F series, I believe, if I recall correctly. But the same principle applies to the MixPre. It also has headphone routing, and that's where you can tell what the mixer should send to your headphone feed. So you'll want to look into that and be able to route the USB to your headphones in addition to your own the microphones to your headphones as well. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that'll get you where you need to go. All right. Next question is from Sean. For a documentary film, I have interviewees' dialogue, music, and sound effects all mixed. It sounds great over headphones, computer speakers, studio monitors, and a TV soundbar, but when we tested it in a very large room using a professional 4-speaker JBL system, which included an amp and mixer board, the sound effects and music were very low in the mix and were overshadowed by the dialogue. How do you prevent that? Well, you have given us one clue, Sean, that I think is really important here. If it sounded great on computer speakers, studio monitors, headphones, and a TV soundbar, the mix is probably fine. And the problem is probably the playback system in this large room with the mixer, and it could be that something funny was going on with the mixer. I assume you just did a stereo mix. If you did a surround mix, that's another story, and it's going to depend on how the JBL system you're talking about, the sound reinforcement system in the large room, was set up. But it sounds like it's something with that system. So you'd want to talk to the mix engineer and say, hey, this is not at all what we heard the mix on everything else. I'm not getting enough of the music and the sound effects. Do you have something, going on here in terms of your configuration? So and you have to do that in a very diplomatic fashion, because you need to not criticize the sound guy. But I would suspect there's something going on with the mix that they're running there through their soundboard. So unless somebody else has other ideas, and we also need clarity, was it a stereo mix or was it a surround mix? If it's a surround mix, then that's actually probably something pretty easy to fix, and it probably have to do with this, the mix that they have set up on the mixing board there. So anyway, some thoughts to consider. Next up from Leo, we have, thanks for the polywave session. They can be confusing when you are, for those that aren't aware of that. So we talked last week about polywave files are recorded wave files that have usually a left and right stereo mix on separate channels, and then isolated microphone channels after that. So it can have tens of different tracks, all in one file, one wave file. And so we did a piece last week where we talked about an application called Wave Agent, which is from Sound Devices, which can actually split those up into individual tracks, or, just take certain parts of it and put it in a new file for you. So question, when you're ready to hand in your sound files, what format do you give the producer? My answer is I give them a polywave file, and I give them a sound report so that they know what's on each channel. The MixPre series, the Sound Devices 600 series, and the Zoom F series all have the ability to create a sound report in the actual mixer itself. Output that to usually a CSV file, and then you can give that on the card to the producer at the end of the day and they'll have everything they need. So you'll want to make sure you name your tracks, your isolated microphone inputs, so that that comes through okay in the sound report, and they know what's there. Really, all you're trying to do is give everything to the editorial team that that they need, and then they'll have the sound report, and they know exactly what's where and what to do with it. And basically, what happens a lot of times with editorial, they'll just mute all of the isolated channels and just work with the stereo mix. So that's generally how that works. And then the sound post team, if you're working on this kind of production, the sound post team will then take the in theory finalized edit, picture locked edit, and picture lock is kind of a joke in post because a lot of times there's no such thing as picture lock at all. Even after the sound mixer gets the job, the overall project and does their mix, a lot of times it'll go back to editorial for additional changes, and that can muddle up the mix, and it's kind of a challenge to work through that. I don't know if there's really a great solution for all of that, but in any case, there's some thoughts on that. Next up, Living Spiritism. You've talked a lot about boom mics, shotguns, cardioids, and lavaliers, but I wanted to ask for your thoughts and opinions about large diaphragm side address cardioid condenser mics. I'm participating in several podcasts each month, and I see a lot of other podcasters using these type of microphones, and I believe you often use one when you live stream. If you can, could you give some pros and cons, when to use one, when not to use one? I'd really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much. Great question. I think it's a topic you could talk about for hours, and I have talked about it with some of my friends. I really like the sound of large diaphragm condenser microphones. I do have the AKG C414. I have one of my first microphones I ever bought was a Rode NT1A, both large diaphragm condenser mics. They're often used in music recording to record vocals, and I think the reason for that is that they're interesting because they have a very large diaphragm. It's usually a 1-inch diaphragm, and that's a little bit more mass to move, and so they tend to work really well for voice because they tend not to emphasize the parts of voice that you don't want too much of. And that's going to be the mouth clicks and they'll still pick up plenty of that. But in theory, that diaphragm's a little bit more mass. And so it takes a little bit more sound pressure level to move that. And this is all me speculating. So sound off in the comments if you have more insights than this. But in general, they sound very, very detailed, but not, they don't respond as quickly to transients generally as smaller diaphragm microphones do. And that can work nicely to kind of smooth out dialogue and or vocals for music. So they can work fine. I think what's important when you're using a large diaphragm condenser microphone is you typically won't work quite up as close on them. Typically you'll back off a little bit more. This is actually a dynamic microphone, not a condenser microphone. So I have to work up pretty close on it. But the condensers, you work back a little bit more. To me, that often has a more natural sound to it. So that's one potential benefit of them. However, what I have found is that if you don't have a room that sounds good, you're going to be picking up what seems like a little bit more of that as well. The dynamic microphones, because they require greater sound pressure levels to capture the audio, you generally end up working up on them closer, and so you have more signal to noise, and you pick up less of the room. These tend to work better, in my opinion, in rooms that are not acoustically treated and not really that great acoustically. So that's why I think the Shure SM7B, for example, has become very, very popular amongst podcasters, is that a lot of podcasters are working in home studios or just households or spare bedrooms or even noisy locations. And this does a pretty good job in those situations. So it's largely an issue of the fact that you have to work up on close up on them generally. And because you do that, you get a very good, strong signal to noise ratio, and so you don't pick up as much of the room. So again, those large diaphragm condensers can sound fantastic, but you do generally need a better sounding room to really kind of make them shine. So hopefully that makes some sense there. Next up from Jamie, I have a question regarding which recording you would choose. Scenario: I usually record to a MixPre 6 and send a signal to my GH5S using the MixPre stereo out during production. Okay. In post, Davinci Resolve 15 Studio version, I usually sync the MixPre recording to my GH5's recording, which produces a mix right, mix left, and track 1. The MP4 recording on the GH5S from the MixPre's stereo out sounds great, but I wonder if the GH5's preamp might be slightly degrading the recording compared to the MixPre's Cashmere preamp original. Syncing doesn't take much time, but involves a few more steps compared to just recording straight from the GH5S, whose audio track came from the MixPre stereo out. Which recording would you use or recommend? I'm guessing the synced one, but would love to hear your thoughts. I think here's the thing: do what works for you. I hear so many people kind of feel like they have to defend their choice to record directly, to use something like a MixPre or a Zoom F series recorder or any audio recorder and feed that into their camera. If it's producing the results you want and need, then that's great. Do that. And to you, if it makes you more inspired and you feel like you can work quicker and you're more motivated, that's great. Do that. However, when you are working in situations where you need your production quality to be as top-notch, best it can possibly be, that's when I generally would use the synced audio. And I would keep the mix track that you record on your MixPre plus the isolated microphone channels. It just gives you more options in post to kind of clean things up when you need to do that, and to really fine-tune the overall sound of the audio. That's another thing, is if you're recording more than 2 microphones, you are automatically recording a mix on your camera. So if you wanted to keep those channels separate, say for example you had a boom and 2 lavalier microphones, you can't do that with a camera, or at least most cameras only have 2 inputs or 1 stereo input, so you're not getting any more than 2 channels. So if you want to be able to have the freedom in post to work on a single isolated channel, then you need to go with your audio recorder's audio. So that's where I look at it. So for example, I'm doing the mix now on a film that I also did the production sound on this last month or so, and we did record separately from the camera. We recorded timecode to the camera and recorded the audio all on my Sound Devices 633. And we did that, of course, so that we could have much more control in post to do a very kind of detailed, proper mix, clean up all the isolated channels, have a choice of the boom or the lav mics, and things of that nature. So that's what it comes down to. If you're doing just YouTube videos, and I don't mean I produce on YouTube as well, so I don't mean to, that's not a denigration, that's not saying that YouTube isn't great, but the expectations for viewers on YouTube usually isn't quite as high. So I think that's a case where it's perfectly legitimate. Tonight, I have the microphone running through the MixPre 10T, and then that output feeding into the Panasonic GH5S. So obviously there's a live stream, so we have to do something like that. But that's, I think what it really comes down to, just be practical about these things. Don't get too caught up in what the ultimate answer or the ultimate solution is. Find what works for your production and go with it. And it's perfectly legitimate to feed the audio to your camera. If I'm hired for a sound job and that's what the production wants, then we do that. It's not a problem. If there's going to be any limitations, like for example, we are having more than 2 microphones, I will tell them, okay, limitation is you will not be able to do a more careful post mix with isolated microphone channels. Are you okay with that? I will do my best to mix it here, but things happen. So I'll do my best to let you know if we run into a problem. So it just really depends on the production. So great questions there. All right, let's come on back. And it looks like we have some comments here. We've had a good long session here. A whole bunch of comments here from Norm. I'm happy to hear joining your live stream for the first time. Welcome, Norm. Matt, Super Chat 1999. Shooting some support. Thanks for the F6 review. Thank you so much, Matt. Alejandro Reyes. Hi, Curtis. It's good to hear from you, Alejandro. And thanks for your question earlier about the microphone from the Russian company. Production Sound, Texas. Hey, I don't think I have seen you around before, so welcome to the session here. Greg, good to hear from you here. Greg asked a good question. Speaking of Audix, have you compared Audix 8 on the Zoom F8N to the 633? Yes, I have. Not on a video, but just in doing my own testing. The Audix on Zoom F8N is a lot more conservative and therefore, from my point of view, generally less effective than the auto mix on the 633, particularly the Dugan auto mixing on the 633. That's almost like magic. It works really, really well. So The problem I have, I think the Zoom F8 and the Zoom F4 and the Zoom F8N, it's firmware. It's really just a program, and hopefully they'll be able to kind of refine that over time. I've given them that feedback. I haven't seen any changes to auto mix yet. It would be nice if they had a few more parameters you could set to kind of fine tune it. So, for example, I would expect it to be. It really only attenuates the microphones that where people aren't currently talking by about 3 dB at the most. Oftentimes even less than that. So to me, that helps a tiny bit, but not a whole lot. Whereas the Dugan Auto Mix is a little bit more. It's a little bit more aggressive, and it uses a patented algorithm. So I think part of it is that the others can't copy it, at least not yet. In any case, so there's some thoughts there. Apple box or C stand for the boom pole? I don't know if that was a question or a response. It may be, yeah, there are Apple boxes that have the boom pole holders just in terms of being able to set them down between takes or what have you. I often use a boom pole if I am doing a static interview shot. You get the boom pole holders and you can put the boom pole in there. So those are some other options there too. Thanks for that. Greg Palmer, did you check out the new K-Tech Classic poles at NAB? No, I tried to go over to the booth and it was a mob there. And so I never made it back, unfortunately. I had intended to, but just ran out of time. And I would like to look at the Classic poles a little closer. I did get a chance to look at the ambient poles, though, and I really like those. I was really impressed with those. All right, Thomas Donalek. Given that the Tentacle has an app, I'm surprised they don't have a visual slate function. Ah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. They actually do. And it's called, let me see if I can find it here. It's called Time Bar. I don't have any tentacles running currently, but it basically is, it's not a slate from the standpoint that it doesn't have a clapper on it, but it does show the time code. So you would just hold that up in front of the frame. I'd forgotten about that. Thank you, Thomas. They actually do. So that answers somebody's question and jogged my mind. So I've never actually used it, but it's there if you do have tentacle syncs. That's one way you can transmit it via Bluetooth to your phone or iPad and display it. I don't know if they have an Android version or not. I know they have an iOS version. All right, next up from Alejandra, recently downloaded Wave Agent to separate polywave files and do sound reports. I'm unfamiliar with the workflow. Can you recommend a good tutorial video, or have you made one? Oh yeah, I just did one last week. If you go to the Curtis Judd audio channel, you will find it there near the top. All right, No Robot Audio. Any decent, affordable supercardioid or hypercardioid for indoor boom? Yeah, we actually did a piece a number of years ago now where we compared a variety of different hypercardioids. And then I've also done with some supercardioids. The Oktava MK-012 is, to me, the best sounding less than $250 option. It does have some issues. It's not perfect. It does tend to be very, very sensitive to handling noise. So if you're going to do a lot of hand booming, you have to get a really good shock mount. Otherwise, you'll pick up a lot of that vibration. But it really, to my ear, it sounds pretty good. So that's probably the cheapest option. But we also did a piece, if you do Curtis Judd 5 indoor boom microphones, do that search over at YouTube. You will find the piece where we compared a microphone from AKG. Audix has one, SEHC1, I think it's called, SXHC1. Also the Audio Technica AT4053B, which is also a hypercardioid. So those are some thoughts there to run with. So it's a great question. Mike, I certainly do not want to use Creative Cloud. Okay. Understand. I'm with you on that. So Norm, panel discussion with 6 wireless lavs. Would you recommend rotating phase inversion between each of the lav sources? I would use your ears to make that decision. So with your headphones on, take a listen and see how things are going. So I would mute 4 of the channels and then just listen to those 2 and get those 2 in phase. Then introduce additional channels one at a time and change the phase if you're hearing clear phase issues, clear warbling and that kind of hollow sound. That's how I would do it. So it's a good question, Norm. Yes, and Norm said they do have this Time Bar app for iOS. It provides a good visual. Agreed. And then Thomas asks, does it pull time code from a tentacle? And the answer is yes, it does. It is actually receiving it via Bluetooth from the tentacle. All right, Greg says, Rohan, you should look at using a splitter. Take the house board out of the signal flow, just less chance for something to go wrong. So yeah, that's a good point. You can use a splitter. You'll probably also want an isolator in addition to that, because sound people get pretty cagey when you are using a splitter in front of their feed, understandably so. So there's a pretty significant investment there. You're going to have to bring splitter cables, and I would bring isolators as well, line isolators, just so that you don't introduce some sort of problem into their mix. But yeah, that's a good point, Greg, on that. All right, Steve. How do you, in editing the sound, take out background noise without impacting the sound clip, generally using Premiere Pro 2019? Well, you use noise reduction, but I generally don't use it too heavily. Here's the thing. You can't take it out. You can reduce it, but you can't take it out. If you take it out, you will start affecting the sound you are trying to keep. So the best you can hope for is generally reducing the background noise. Isotope makes the best sound reduction that I've used. It can plug into Premiere Pro. It's called Isotope RX, and if you just want the Isotope RX elements, that's the least expensive package they sell, but it does have the noise reduction in it, and that can do just worlds of good. It can do really, really nice noise reduction. However, keep in mind, it will never take all of it out, so don't ever expect that. And honestly, there's also this balance point, and I think we talked about this a little bit with Greg's question earlier. To some extent, you don't want a recording that's in a factory or a coffee shop to sound like it's in a studio, because then it's like this, it creates cognitive dissonance. It's like the people are watching a coffee shop, but it doesn't sound like a coffee shop. It sounds like a recording studio. And that, it kind of is weird. It doesn't sound right. So it's okay to have some of that background noise in there. The only thing you really need to be concerned about is, does it sound like it's in place? Does it sound right? Does it sound real? So that's just something to take into consideration when it comes to reducing noise. All right, Norm was just clarifying, yes, it does connect to the Tentacle, that app, the Time Bar app, so that's great. And then they also have the Recorder app, which also will sync via Bluetooth to your phone. So if you're shooting with your phone and another timecode device with a Tentacle sync attached to it, you can do that as well, which is pretty cool. Art Johnson, just checking in. Art, thanks for joining us. All right, Roma, best budget microphone in your opinion for YouTube videos? Currently, I'm using the Rode Video Micro with the Zoom H1n, but I feel it's not as good as I want it to be. That's a great question. The trick with the Rode Video Micro, which is actually not a bad mic for its price, is that it just has it's a more focused polar pattern than your camera, but it's still not very focused, and especially if you have it mounted on top of your camera. So if you can get that in closer, it can actually sound really good using an extension cable. That's one option. You just get it in closer and boom it above the frame. So that's one very low-cost option for what you have. You could do a similar thing with a Deity D3 Pro, which is about a $200 microphone. And that one's set up a little bit better to do that because you can actually, it comes with an XLR adapter. So that's something to consider. The thing I like about that microphone is that it's pretty versatile. You can put it on top of your camera. It has the mounting kit and the shock mount, but you can also boom it on a boom pole if you wanted to do that. And then you can get it in a lot closer and it will sound a lot better. So probably, Roma, that's the number one thing. You want to get that microphone closer, whatever one you use. Obviously, there's also the Rode Video Mic Pro Plus. You can do the same thing with that. Use an extension cable, get it boomed in close, and it will sound a lot better. If you want an XLR-based microphone, the Audio Technica AT870, what is it, 875R? I don't think that's the right number. I'll try and put a link for it afterwards. But that's probably just under $200, and a lot of people really like that one. I haven't personally tested it, but I've heard it used in a variety of YouTube videos, and it actually sounds pretty good as well, so that's something to consider. Next question from Norm Claire. How do you have comments come up on screen like this? So awesome. I use an app, so we're live streaming obviously to YouTube. I'm using an app on Mac called Ecamm Live, ECAMM Live, and it has that functionality. So I have a little comment and reactions window up here, I can click on a little link underneath each comment that says add to broadcast. And that puts it up on the screen. So I wanted to thank everyone who was able to join today. For those of you that are watching after the fact, thanks for contributing your questions ahead of time. I appreciate that. Get out there, make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care, everybody.